Welcome you to the Health Services Research Association of Australia and New Zealand's webinar this morning. The Health Services Research Association was established to provide networking, education and training and build capacity in health services research in both Australia and New Zealand. Our key activity is our biennial Health Services and Policy Research Conference. And our next conference is actually being held next week on the Gold Coast, starting on the 31st of October with pre-conference workshops. And the theme this year is Shifting Priorities, Balancing Acute and Primary Care Services. And if you're interested, you can still register. We've got a great lineup of keynote speakers and concurrent sessions. And if you visit the association website, you'll find the link to the conference registration page. As well as our conference, we also aim to run these webinars monthly throughout the year. The webinars are free, but we do encourage participants to think about joining the association, as we do rely on membership fees to fund our activities. And we are very keen to hear from participants for other speakers and topics that they'd like us to cover in 2018. Other activities include a mentoring scheme for early career researchers and a number of awards and prizes that we give each year to the best and most impactful health services research. And the 2017 awards will be announced at our conference next week, so that's another reason to get along to the event. We also have a very vibrant website and a regular newsletter covering all the latest health services research news and new journal articles, jobs and events. And you can sign up for that newsletter on the HSRAANZ website. Now I'm going to hand over to Janet McDonald, who will be chairing this morning's session, and she will introduce our speakers and manage the Q&A session, which we'll take at the end of the two presentations. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, look, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Ben White, who's the Director of the Australian Centre for Health Law Research in the Faculty of Law at the Queensland University of Technology. And his area of research focus is end-of-life decision-making, and he's undertaking a number of Australian Research Council-funded studies examining law at the end of life. So looking forward to this presentation here about what futility means, an empirical study of doctors' perceptions. So over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Janet, and thanks, Sarah, as well, and thanks for the opportunity to present this research. This is research that Lindy and I have been doing, which is actually clinically initiated. Clinicians came to us and said this is important research, there's an issue that they would like tackled, so hopefully it's of interest. It draws on a paper published in the Medical Journal of Australia, which I'll provide a link to at the end, so I might move through some parts of it reasonably quickly. Okay, in terms of the research team, we were fortunate, and I make this presentation on behalf of the research team, fortunate to have an interdisciplinary group working on this issue of futility. It's a complex problem, so to have expertise from these fields of law, social science, medical ethics, medicine, psychology and health economics, all sitting around the table working together on this problem was of great assistance in terms of thinking through the challenges it presents. I note, of course, we were well supported by two senior research assistants as well that you see on the bottom of the slide. Professor Leonie Callaway from the Royal Brisbane Women's Hospital in Queensland was our clinical lead with our partner organisation for this project. In addition to Leonie, there was also a futility research group at the Royal, so we were grateful to their support as well. A number of clinicians spent time working with us in terms of shaping the project and also interpreting the findings. And I also want to acknowledge the participation of the two other hospitals. So as you'll see, the interviews we're talking about were done in 3 hospitals, and so we're grateful for the support of those other 2 hospitals as well. And of course, we want to thank and acknowledge the 96 doctors who took the time to talk to us about this topic of futility. Without their assistance, of course, this research wouldn't be possible. So a bit of an overview, I'll give a bit of a flavour about the project and method, but in terms of results, I'll focus really in, you would have seen that I'm interested in what futility means and how doctors define it. So Lindy will be talking about a separate part of the study. What my focus is on how doctors conceptualise this issue of futile treatment and the role it played in their clinical decision making. So this is a little bit, I guess, captures what the project was all about. And this is a quote from the interviews from one of our intensivists who we interviewed. And I asked him the question, yeah, of course there's something I can do, but is it the appropriate thing to do? And that's really at the heart of what the project was about. We were seeking to understand the concept of futility, futile treatment, how often it happens, the drivers and reasons for it, and indeed the cost. And I might just briefly mention there's a paper from our research team in BMJ Open, led by Hannah Carter with Nick Graves, which actually picks up some of those frequency and cost issues. We won't be talking so much about today, but if you're interested in having a look, that's come out in the last week or so. So you'll see futile treatment is in inverted commas there so that we don't bore you throughout the rest of the presentation. We won't put it in inverted commas for the rest of the presentation, but we did want to note this is, of course, a contested term. There's a long theoretical literature, there's long literature in the medical ethics about what this actually means, and a range of different terms used, including potentially inappropriate treatment, potentially non-beneficial treatment, and so on. When we conceptualised this study, I think it was sort of 7 or 8 years ago, futility was the term that was used at that point mostly, so that's the term we've used here, but we know it is a contested term as to what it means, and there's a range of other phrases used as well. So in terms of the method, stage 1 involved an analysis of laws and policies. We wanted to see not only talk to doctors and do a chart audit, as you see from stages 2 and 3, but we understand the regulatory context in which these decisions were made and what impact that would have. Stage 2 is the focus of today's presentations. This was 96 semi-structured in-depth interviews with doctors on the topics you can see on the slide. And the third stage was a retrospective chart audit. And the paper that I mentioned before, and BMJ Open, was the first paper out of that chart audit. There's some more on the way. So we were focusing on stage 2 today. We're very lucky to have on our research team Cindy Galwar, a very experienced health researcher, both quant and qual. And she was integral to designing what the research method looked like for stage 2. And we also were grateful for the assistance of the fertility research group at the Royal Brisbane Women's Hospital. Really ensured that the sort of questions we were asking, the things that we're dealing with in the interview guide, and how we addressed the research findings, trying to connect that to clinical practice. As you can imagine, there was some fun with ethics across multiple sites before we recruited at those 3 tertiary public hospitals that I mentioned before. We proposed maximum variation sampling to try and get a wide range of views on this complex topic of futility. As I mentioned, 96 doctors kindly agreed to participate in the study from a range of specialties, and you can see here the specialties they came from. So the first 4, we made sure we interviewed a number of clinicians across each of the 3 hospitals. They're obviously integrally involved in various aspects of end-of-life decision making, so having that input across all 3 hospitals we thought was important. Thereafter, there's a lot of overlap in terms of the specialties engaged with each of the hospitals, but some hospitals tend to focus, for example, on renal or cardiology, and in that setting we may only have 2 hospitals represented in that way. In terms of medical administration, often when these disputes about whether treatment should be given or not, they can often sort of bubble their way up to the medical administrative support of the hospital. So we made sure we engaged with at least 1 medical administrator from each of those 3 hospitals as well. After developing and piloting the interview guide, we adopted a convergent interviewing technique, starting with a very sort of open general question. Futility obviously is a multifaceted concept, and we didn't want to dive in and sort of start guiding or directing very early, so we started very broad. Interviews continued till saturation with the usual approach to transcribing and analysing, but we did adopt a framework approach to this analysis. So looking not only at themes across those 96 interviews, but we also did a separate case-based analysis to try and work out what each of the cases, each of the doctors was telling us about futility. So we looked at the data in both ways. So in terms of results, and sorry, I should just give a couple of limitations which we mentioned in the paper. Obviously, what we're talking about here is doctors' perceptions of futile treatment. We're not reporting these as empirical facts. This is how doctors perceived the issue of futility and what happened, as we'll see later on. And we also acknowledge that in a study like this, we rely on volunteers. So those who spoke to us, we suspect, were interested in the topic, and obviously that may have coloured their perceptions. We will talk about some numbers, so talk about what percentage of people said A, B or C when we go through, but of course this is a qualitative study. But given the large numbers, reasonably large numbers involved for a qualitative study with 96 doctors interviewed, we have presented that information as well to help people think about and see sort of the weight of views, if that makes sense. Okay, so why is futile treatment a problem? This is I guess the so what question, to give a little bit of context. Why did the doctors that we interviewed see that futility was a problem? And as I mentioned earlier on, this was a study which was conceptualised and in fact initiated by a group of clinicians who said, we'd like to know more about this. On the slide there is a quote from a haematologist, which I'll let you read. But you'll see that the core of the concern here was very much about prolonging discomfort or the dying process. And that was at the top of the list of the reasons the doctors gave for why they felt futile treatment was a problem. This idea of intervening and stopping someone who's already dying, already uncomfortable, for no benefit. A number of doctors you'll see also spoke about the waste of resources. So this is a problem because this is resources which are wasted, not helping a patient, which could be used somewhere else. So at this point, I do note that's different from defining futile treatment as a waste of resources. So it's futile because it's not worth it, it's not cost effective. That wasn't the point that was being made here. We'll talk about that shortly. The point here was if treatment is futile, providing it can't help, and therefore it is a waste of resources. Doctors also pointed to the adverse outcomes of treatment, the chance to miss a good death, and little to gain and false hope as well. You'll see some of these concerns that the doctors raised are returned to when we talk about the definition of futility that doctors shared with us. So how did doctors define futile treatment? Of our 96 doctors, these three broad themes emerged for how doctors conceptualised futile treatment. So everyone talked about the nature of patient benefit, and I'll talk a bit more about each of these three in turn. Most people talked about the chance of patient benefit, and you'll see from even a basic doing the sums that obviously there's some overlap. Everyone's talking about patient benefit, and most of them are also talking about chance of benefit. The idea of resources, which I mentioned before, was less common, only 17 doctors, but it did arise, and there were some views about treatment can be futile if it's not worth it from that perspective. So we'll talk about each of them a little in turn, and my apologies, I know this slide is a little bit busy. I want to give a flavour of the nature of patient benefit that doctors thought was important. And again, there's overlap across these groups here. But broadly, doctors spoke about the level of benefit, and the classic example there being burdens outweighing benefits. They spoke of the type of benefit. Quality and quantity of life were important here. Some doctors stepped past that and really focused globally and looked at the overall outcome. So, for example, death is imminent. One clinician, a respiratory medicine consultant, said it's not going to change the big picture, was the wording that she used. Reversibility arose as well, particularly for the doctors that we spoke to in ICU. Others conceptualised this idea of nature of patient benefit in terms of not achieving a goal of treatment. So you can see there's a range of ways in which patient benefit was spoken about, but it really was at the heart of this idea of what counts as futile treatment. Chance of benefit, chance of patient benefit was the second sort of element of futility in the discussions that we had with doctors. And you can see there's a range of views here. At the top of the list was insignificant or no chance of benefit, which, as you can see, is different from no chance, so that there was some variation here on what counted as a sufficient chance of patient benefit to either make it futile or not. Mostly that was done in sort of qualitative terms, talking about words like insignificant, low chance, negligible, very low. You see on the bottom two, the next two options, some doctors, but not very many, did talk about specific percentages. And sometimes that was linked to specific cases. So, for example, if treatment X has only got a 5% chance, I won't give it. Other doctors, smaller number of doctors, sort of said, look, if any treatment has only got a 3% chance or a 1% chance, then I regard that as futile. So there's a range of different views on benefit here, but again, a very significant and core part of how doctors saw futility. Some quotes here to give a flavour of some of the different perspectives. So the first one is from a renal medicine consultant, a female, and the second is also from a woman neurosurgery consultant as well, and give a different flavour of the types of ways in which the chance of benefit is understood. Not worth the resources, again, this is a smaller group, and again, I'll just let you read the quotes there. The first, emergency medicine consultant female, second from renal, the third is an emergency medicine consultant male. So different approaches taken in a smaller group, but some doctors, and not a tiny group, some doctors were thinking about when treatment's futile or not, the resource implications that go with that. So when looking at this data, the research team sat around that table I mentioned before for some lively discussion about what all that meant and how to try and put together some kind of understanding of what doctors thought futile treatment was, how they defined this concept. And of interest was when we looked at the data, there was this broad consensus that emerged about what futile treatment means. And we did look, for example, across gender, across age, across specialty, religious affiliation, to see whether there was any difference or variation in how doctors spoke about futility in terms of defining it, and nothing significant emerged in terms of those trends. So a broadly consistent approach emerged, and from the data that we've shown you, we as a group distilled over much discussion the following definition that you can see on the slide there. Very low chance of meaningful benefit to the patient in terms of those three domains: quality of life, improving quality of life, prolonging life of acceptable quality, benefits that outweigh burdens of treatment. You can see here there's a clear preference for qualitative measures of what counts as futile treatment or not. And one of the things that we thought as a group was interesting about this was that, as many people listening in will know, there is a large literature out there which deals with futility or potentially inappropriate treatment. And a lot of it has attempted to define that conceptually, so trying to advance conceptual definitions which have been critiqued and engaged with. So this was different in that it was a ground-up approach which tried to step past some of that and said, well, look, can we reach some kind of consensus conceptually, looking empirically at how doctors understand and engage with this concept? But how is futility applied in a clinical setting? And a quote from renal medicine consultant male on the slide there. And this reflected some of the challenges that clinicians spoke with us about translating what might be reasonably clear in their mind and seem to be clear across the group of what futility means, but actually translating that to clinical decision making was regarded as tough, and you can see reference to grey zones in that quote as well. Over half the doctors specifically said, look, this is a challenge. Some talked about it's a bit grey, and it's difficult to know what benefit's enough and from whose perspective benefit should be counted. So the take home for our group was that, yes, there's some broad consensus as to what the concept of futility means, but in terms of actually operationalising that by the bedside and making clinical decisions, some challenges remained. One of the things that emerged from the data was this concept of justifiable futile treatment. And over the half of the doctors that we spoke with would identify situations of futile treatment that nevertheless they felt was justified. So treatment's futile, but it was okay to provide it in this instance because, and here there was a range of discussions, range of reasons given, but largely grouped around either family needs, and this was especially short-term treatment. So providing treatment to stabilise a patient who wasn't going to survive, but to enable family to gather or to grieve or to work through the decision-making process. Sometimes it was also in terms of patient benefit. So there was a discussion there about including non-clinical ways. So allowing sort of, I guess, patching up a patient, helping them continue living so that they could see an important social event, a wedding of a child or a birth of a grandchild, something like that. So we thought this was an interesting concept, treatment that's futile and yet justifiable. And we thought this was relevant to this idea of definitions because, well, if it is futile, especially from the patient benefit perspective, if it's futile but regarded as justified from the patient benefit perspective, is that treatment really futile? Have we got a sort of some circularity in thinking here? And indeed, one of the doctors specifically commented on this, an ICU consultant male, talked about justifiable futile treatment, but then sort of asked the question, well, actually, is it futile? So some interesting thoughts there about how those definitional issues may expand depending on what counts as patient benefit and may fit within that box. And we sort of, I guess, noted this possibility of there being a concept of medical futility. So that's futile treatment, which shouldn't be provided from a clinical perspective, but justifiable futile treatment, which nevertheless may be permitted. I'll talk some more about that shortly. So in terms of concluding observations, the research pointed to adverse consequences for futile treatment for patients, for families, clinicians, and indeed society. One of the early slides I talked about the concerns that doctors raised, and a number of doctors spent some time talking about their deep concerns about providing futile treatment, about harming patients, about harming families, but feeling stuck in that cycle of doing so. We also found that futility was a term that was used in clinical practice, and as I noted before, we are talking with a group of clinicians who are interested in this topic, so that may shape thinking. But there has been some critique about we should not talk about futility or we should use different terms. But this was a term that doctors were comfortable with, that they used readily when describing situations that they saw and thought were futile. So in contrast to some of those critiques. We also found that broad conceptual consensus as to what futility means, and I mentioned before that definition that we pulled out from the data, and that aligns broadly with the ethical and policy guidelines, for example, the AMA position statements in this field. There's broad overlap with how that's conceptualised. But sitting underneath this consensus is a high level of variability in terms of how it's operationalised and actual decision making that occurs in the clinical setting. And we see at least three sources of evidence for this. One is the specific acknowledgement of variability. A number of doctors said, look, I think I know what futile treatment means, but when I get to actually making these decisions or trying to reach a view about it in a particular instance, there is some greyness there, there is some uncertainty. The second point to make, I guess, is that some kind of variability is inevitable. We're talking about qualitative criteria, things like patient benefit, chance of patient benefit will inevitably involve some kind of subjectivity that surrounds qualitative criteria like that. And indeed, there is a significant role of values in these decisions as to what counts as enough benefit, what counts as enough chance, and doctors acknowledge that too. We also see some variability in this idea of whether treatment was justifiable futile treatment, or whether actually we should label that as not being futile treatment because there is some patient benefit there. So high-level consensus, but when it comes to the bedside, some challenges in terms of operationalising. So the research team's thoughts on this were that it's important to be aware of that variability in futility assessments. If a clinician is going to say treatment's futile in their view, it's important to note that obviously is a subjective assessment, and other doctors, other patients, other family members may well have different views. It also points to any decision about patient benefit must meaningfully engage patients and families, and the cohort of decisions which can be made on purely clinical grounds are very, very, very small. So if you're thinking about patient benefit and what counts as patient benefit, that necessarily must involve engaging with patients and families about their goals for care and their goals more broadly, as we've seen. And indeed, a number of doctors specifically noted this point in their practice. So perhaps this futility assessment really is a trigger for this sort of engagement. That a doctor arrives and reaches the view that treatment's futile and makes that assessment. But that isn't sort of the end of the decision. It isn't the end of the dialogue. Indeed, that's such a trigger for engagement that may be ongoing and long-term engagement with patient and family. And perhaps that's reflected in this notion of justifiable futile treatment that we talked about before, that it may be regarded as clinically futile, but perhaps not in fact futile. And one of the things that the research team in the paper, which I mentioned, we talked about perhaps a better label might be appropriate treatment, all things considered, rather than justifiable futile treatment. So I'll conclude there. There's the reference to the paper that I mentioned, and of course there's the project website if you're interested in some of the other papers arising from that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. I think we're going to move on to Linda's presentation next, is that correct? And then we'll take questions at the end. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Professor Lindy Wilmot. She's a Professor with the Faculty of Law at the Queensland University of Technology and a Director for the Australian Centre for Health Law Research at QUT. And she publishes and researches and publishes extensively in the area of health law, particularly, again, end-of-life issues. So continuing our discussion today, her topic is what are these drivers of futile treatment, again, from the doctor's perceptions. So welcome, Lindy, and over to you.
Thanks, Janet, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. So yes, this is the second instalment of the same study, and again, I acknowledge that I'm making this presentation on behalf of that interdisciplinary team that Ben described before, and I too would like to acknowledge our research partners, without whom we wouldn't have been able to undertake this study. And I particularly want to acknowledge the 96 doctors who kindly gave up a lot of their time to assist us with this research. And I'll also mention or refer back to the limitations of our study. This aspect of it was a qualitative research project with the limitations that involves. And I too will be giving numbers, because although it's qualitative study, it is a relatively large one involving 96 doctors. So we thought that the use of numbers in terms of how many doctors felt what about futile treatment being provided may be useful. So in the 96 interviews, the doctors talked at length about various different factors that lead them at times, or other doctors at times, to provide treatment even though they may think it is futile. However, that definition is defined, that term is defined. And what we did was that we tried to allocate those factors into three broad themes. We felt that those factors could be related or categorised into one of those three themes. They obviously add up to more than 96 because doctors mentioned a range of factors, as I said. So in terms of, just let me explain what we mean by these different headings. The doctor-related factors refer to factors that relate to how doctors think and behave. Some of these are factors that relate to their emotions and personality. The patient-related factors, as the name suggests, related to issues specific to that particular patient. So it may not be a feature in the provision of treatment to other patients. And the third were hospital-related factors. We recognised, after looking at all of the factors raised by doctors, that hospitals are big organisations and as such develop ways of operating. And some of these ways of operating did encourage or make the provision of futile treatment an easy thing to do. So we'll work through the various factors that fall within each of these headings. So turning first to the doctor-related factors, and we identified 9 themes of the doctor-related factors. And you can see the first one, being trained to treat, was the one that was nominated by the most number of doctors. 81 of the 96 doctors did identify that the fact that doctors feel as though they are trained to keep treating patients may be one of the factors which lead them at times to provide futile treatment. They talked about pursuing a cure rather than shifting to palliative treatment. And associated with that, I guess, was the aversion to death, the 4th bullet point down there, which is starred. That is associated, that they, that some doctors identified that they saw death as a failure, or some of their colleagues sought death as a failure, and therefore there was sort of that reversion to train to treat default. That 2nd bullet point, a lot of the doctors said that they were more likely to provide treatment with a curative goal when they were earlier on in their careers. And as they became more experienced, they were more likely to call it and more likely to be confident and say, well, this is treatment which is not going to provide benefit, and therefore less likely to provide the futile treatment. But there were lots of examples of the train to treat, and I thought it might be useful to give a couple of quotes which gives a flavour of some of the attitudes that the doctors were mentioning. This one was a geriatrician, and of course some of the doctors are saying, well, it's not me, but my colleagues are doing it. So the reference to they're trained to treat. You learn how to treat, and it's easy to treat. It's much easier to treat than to have those high-level discussions where you talk about end of life and not treating. So the default is to keep treating. And another example of this was from a surgery consultant who said, you do a procedure because it can be done, even if it doesn't change the outcome. Recently, we did a big operation to take out most of his cancer, but because it was only most of it, it's not actually going to change anything. If we'd thought that through beforehand, we would have not done that treatment. So patients, doctors don't want to give up hope, and that was identified by 38 of the doctors. It may be that this particular treatment, although we don't think it will, perhaps it will provide some benefit to the patient. So if we don't give it, it's like we've given up on them. And associated with that, which is starred, the second last point, is the emotional attachment to patients. So doctors become close to patients and they want to keep treating if there is a possibility that it may work, and they don't want to give up on the patient. And this theme about the emotional attachment was identified particularly where the patient was seen on an ongoing basis, such as in the specialties of oncology, renal medicine and respiratory medicine. Worries about legal risk, you can see 29 doctors identified this. This wasn't a surprise to the research team. We expected that doctors would nominate this. They're concerned about being sued if they didn't provide treatment, particularly if the patient, or more likely the patient's family, is really pressuring for something else to be done. Surely you can do something else. The extent to which doctors thought this was a factor did depend on the doctor's individual degree of risk tolerance. Some doctors may be more confident and prepared to wear that sort of worry at the back of their head, while others weren't. Some doctors thought this was a overstated claim, and there wasn't that level of concern about legal risk. But one example of a doctor who thought that they weren't really supported by the system, including sort of the law and the framework within which they were operating, is given by this quote: "If you don't have a system you can hang your hat on to say that this is how we've come to this decision, this is our system, these are our guidelines, we've complied with our guidelines, we're safe, then you're out there exposed. So you need courage, and this isn't a system that encourages or rewards courage." So this was a medical administrator, didn't feel that the system supported doctors to back their clinical judgment in some cases. Poor communication and doing everything possible were factors, interrelated, I think, which were nominated by a number of doctors. So 28 doctors identified poor communication skills. They talked about avoidance and discomfort with a conversation about dying. And they talked about one strategy some doctors employ is providing a smorgasbord of treatment options instead of offering only those that were reasonably likely to provide a benefit to the patient. And they identified that as a problematic strategy. Doing everything possible was identified by 23 doctors, and some doctors said, well, they do this in a desire to satisfy patients and their families, and sometimes even the treating team. So no stone is left unturned. And this is easy to do in a tertiary hospital too, where blood tests, scans, x-rays and the like are readily available and can be done. One example of this kind of issue, that doing everything possible, was mentioned by an emergency medical consultant. My colleagues tend to leave no stone unturned with things that might be, quote unquote, potentially reversible. It's because they don't have the clinical confidence to say, well, that's true, but death is not potentially reversible, and that's the trajectory we are on. And finally, I'll mention that doctors' personality or personal experiences, or possibly even religion, were identified by 12 of the 96 doctors as being potentially a factor in providing futile treatment. Some doctors mentioned that it was the personality of some doctors to be hanger-oners, and that more emotive doctors, quote, tend to push for more futile treatment, unquote, because they have a harder time accepting death. One cardiologist said that. There were mixed views about religion. Some doctors thought this really made a difference, whether the person was particularly religious, the doctor was particularly religious or not. Others thought it was completely irrelevant. This is an example of this is a quote where the doctor thought it did make a difference. I see it all the time, where those doctors, devout doctors, who have a strong right to life, when they are practicing on their own without any integration with any other doctors, they can go on clearly without any interference on their futile way. So moving then to the second major category, which is patient-related factors. 87 of the 96 doctors identified at least one of these three patient-related factors. So it was clearly an important issue. 63 doctors cited family or patient request. So that's a high number. And again, the treating team wasn't overly surprised about that. When we were discussing the research project before we actually applied for Australian Research Council funding, this was one of the things we thought that the research would find. And 63 doctors did identify this as an issue, particularly where a family member was a lawyer maybe, or there was some suggestion that the family really wasn't happy if further treatment isn't provided, and they were going to take the matter further, whether it was to the hospital administration or to legal possibilities. Prognostic uncertainty, 47 doctors identified that, and some doctors talked in terms of wanting to give the patient the benefit of the doubt. and also the fear of making the wrong decision. It's likely that the treatment's not going to work, but there's always that tiny chance that it might work. They also talked about learning from their experience, and they were more likely to take a punt and likely to back their assessment the more experienced they became. Some doctors were less accepting of this as a reason for providing futile treatment, and they said doctors should be more willing to make tough decisions. And 36 doctors talked about lack of information about patient wishes. This was identified particularly by emergency physicians, so where patients were wheeled in and they didn't know too much about what the patient would have wanted, there was a tendency in that scenario to provide treatment that they thought would be futile. Some doctors, again in emergency, expressed surprise that where some patients came from a residential aged care facility, and even with the family, that the family hadn't spoken yet to the patient, who usually had comorbidities, about what they wanted in terms of end-of-life treatment. Just an example of the family or patient request, which was a strong theme. This is one of the quotes. Patients' families often have unrealistic expectations. The provision of futile treatment will probably come down to how forthright or aggressive the family are, and also come down to the doctor's ability to deal with that, their confidence or their courage of conviction from a cardiology consultant. So turning then to hospital-related factors, 78 doctors nominated at least one of these hospital-related factors, and you can see that we've categorised these into 6 themes. So as I mentioned, we're talking here about how these big organisations operate, and sometimes they operate in a way that leads to or makes it easy to provide futile treatment. 27 doctors talked about specialisation, and they talked about the development of specialties and subspecialties, which meant that more people were involved in the care of a patient, but the care was focused on that particular part of the patient that they had expertise in, instead of a doctor being responsible for the overall care and stepping back and seeing the patient as a whole. One doctor referred to this as bits and pieces management, the fact that so many specialists can be involved for one patient. Medical hierarchy was also mentioned quite frequently, suggestion that the consultants who are making the treatment decisions spend the least time with the patients and are probably least across what it is that the patients want, and maybe are not across the goals of care that the patient might have, and might be happy not to have some of the treatment that is being suggested. Those next 2 bullet points, the hospital is designed to provide acute care, so it does, and it's hard to stop treatment once started. It was identified by a lot of doctors as well, and they are interrelated. So one of the doctors talked about or likened treatment in a hospital like being on a passenger on, quote, an express train that only goes in one direction. And once a treatment trajectory has been set, it's easier just to let it go rather than divert that train from that particular path and shift to, say, a palliative pathway. Time pressures, 18 doctors mentioned that it's quicker to talk about a treatment plan than to have a time-consuming, long conversation about the fact that a patient is dying and how that end-of-life care might roll out. And 10 doctors nominated after-hours care. They said that the staff on duty after hours are sometimes junior staff, not really familiar with the patient, doesn't really know the patient's goals of care to the same extent that the treating team does, and therefore if a decision has to be made about treatment, they're more likely to make a conservative conservative decision to provide treatment rather than to stop treatment. So I guess that's all I really wanted to say, to give you an outline about the relevant factors in relation to treatment. I guess some concluding observations would be that why treatment is futile treatment is sometimes provided at the end of life is a really complex issue, and there are a range of factors which contribute to the provision of futile treatment, and there is no easy solution. There's probably things that have to happen at the community level, at the hospital level, at the doctor level, and there's a conversation that we could have about that. The other thing I'll just mention is that some of these doctors, and I haven't got time to talk about it today, some of the doctors talked about strategies that they used to stop futile treatment being provided, and also systemic issues that they think are needed to address this issue on a holistic level. So I'll just leave you the presentation that I gave is what was reported in that paper published in the Journal of Medical Ethics by our team, and that's available from the project website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lindy, and also again to Ben for really interesting presentations. Well, I have two questions to start with, and anyone else, if you want to type in a question, please do. This first one comes from Adam Chapman at the Department of Health and Human Services in Victoria, and he says there's quite a lot of literature that looks at aggressive treatment at end-of-life care in a similar way to futile treatment, but to patients and clinicians, the terms aggressive and futile can have quite different connotations. Patients may say, you think it's futile, but I may be in the 5% who benefit from this, in which case the term futile can only be understood following the failure of the intervention. They may, however, agree with the notion that such a treatment is aggressive, and they may desire that approach to their care. So Adam's question is, do you think there's a difference between what the literature considers futile and aggressive interventions around end-of-life care, and should we seek to clarify the discourse around this by carefully considering which term or terms we use and how they're considered by both patients and by clinicians?
Yeah, look, thanks. That's a very good point and a good question. The issue of definitions is one I sort of flagged at the beginning. So futility was the sort of term that we used in this project, but there's a range of others, including potentially inappropriate treatment and so on. And one of the challenges, which you've alluded to, is if people are defining this issue of treatment which should not be given or is inappropriate, depending on how you frame it. You're measuring different things. So if, for example, someone's talking about futile treatment, that may be different from potentially inappropriate treatment. So the point about clarifying and developing a discourse to try and consistently describe what we're talking about and how we measure it, I think is a really, really good point. Some progress, I think, has been made on this through a range of literature, but there's the most recent ATS position statement in the US, which runs through a range of different types of ways to describe what we're talking about today as futile treatment, with a view to trying to, I guess, provide a consistent approach to that. So I think it's a good point. There is some work being done on that, but it would be helpful to define and measure this phenomenon.
I'd just add to that some doctors were of the view that it was really unhelpful to be talking about the term futility at all, but certainly not to patients because of, as we've talked about this morning already, the very subjective nature of the treatment and the fact that it might be regarded as futile by the treating team because of the chance of success or the invasiveness versus palliative care. Clearly, it's possible for a patient to have a different view and don't regard it as futile at all.
Thanks. Okay, the second question comes from Belinda O'Sullivan. She says, a question for Ben. Did you find differences between specialists in terms of how they view futility? So given, for example, that emergency physicians may have less time to engage patients and families when making futility decisions, whereas the oncologists, etc., may know the patients and families quite well and have a reasonably well-formed sense of futility with respect to patient and family context.
Yeah, look, that's a good point, and we had wondered what impact specialty impact it may have. So far as the definitional issues are concerned, we did specifically look at that, and interestingly, there wasn't really much variation across specialties. So it may well be The operationalisation of decision making may differ, where you know a patient well or any examples given. But we didn't find differences in terms of how different specialties spoke about that. Probably the one minor exception to that was the issue of irreversibility was probably mentioned most by intensive care specialists, but otherwise there was surprisingly, we were surprised by this, broad consensus across specialties as to that definition of futility I mentioned.
I should mention in relation to reasons doctors provide treatment, we thought that there would be variability across specialties too, and generally speaking we didn't find that either. I did mention in my talk the one difference was in the emotional attachment to patients, and that may result in more futile treatment. That was more likely to be at least identified by some of the doctors where you've got an ongoing relationship with a patient, such as renal, respiratory physicians.
Sarah, I think. No, that's okay. Please again if anyone else has got a question, just down the bottom of your screen there's a place you can type in there. While you might be doing that, I have a question. Yeah, just wondering if you have any thoughts about doctors training around this area, what might help them in addressing this sort of issue better?
Yep. I mentioned just at the end of my talk that doctors did talk about strategies that they used, but also, as I said, systemic issues that needed to be addressed. And doctors' training was one of the issues that they mentioned. And they mentioned, a number of doctors mentioned two things in particular. And one is to be able to diagnose dying, which is maybe something that doctors don't do very well, some doctors were suggesting. So that was one suggestion, and the other was in relation to communication. Doctors thought that this was the single most thing that needed to be improved to stop, and strategy used by them to stop the provision of futile treatment. So talking to the patients and to the families very early, when a patient comes in and once all of the information is known, having an honest discussion about what the position is, about expectations, what they're going to do, and just keeping them appraised all the way through the trajectory of the patient. So when a decision does have to be made, if it does have to be made about end of life, it doesn't come as a surprise. They know it's coming, so they're better prepared for it. So that were the two things suggested by the doctors, and I think there's something to that.
Thanks. We have two questions here from Bobby in Indonesia. He asks, what's the function of the primary hospital in Australia for end-of-life care cancer, and does the primary hospital provide morphine for pain-free cancer patients? I'm not quite sure about primary hospital or whether he's thinking of primary health care. I'm not certain, but any comments about those questions?
Sorry, do you mind just saying that one again?
Yeah, so the first one is, what's the function of the primary hospital in Australia for end-of-life care cancer? I'm not sure though what a primary hospital is, or whether he's thinking about the primary health care setting instead.
Yeah, look, I guess my only comment on that is I'm very conscious of not pushing beyond my disciplinary expertise. We worked with a group of doctors and ethicists and others on this project. By training, we're lawyers, so I probably myself wouldn't be drifting into commenting on structural organisation of health issues, as I suspect there's folks who know a lot more about that than me.
Sure. Okay, I'll move on to a question then from Diana Contreras, who says, from your study, is there something you can say about coordination between intensive care or emergency and palliative care in order to minimise futile treatment?
I guess what was emerging from the study is that the issue of how the hospitals do operate was certainly one of the issues that doctors nominated as a driver of futile treatment. So there were suggestions that the way it is set up, a person comes in, if they have comorbidities, they have a whole lot of different specialists who might be are looking after them. And that might mean, as I mentioned, that people are focusing on different bits and pieces of the body. So some of the suggestions were that there are different structures put in place in hospitals which more clearly require, and again, this is outside my expertise, this might be happening in some hospitals, but they were suggesting that you might need to have more a team approach. So there's one person in charge of the person, and that person takes more of a holistic look at the whole patient, and that requires more communication, more team meetings, so that there can be a discussion about that person generally and all of the ailments, and as a whole, what is the best way forward. So that's just one example of systemic change, which might be useful to explore in the hospital setting. And sorry, I just should add, I guess, palliative care. This is a broader question than our study, I suppose. It would be good to include a palliative care physician earlier and more frequent in many cases. But that, of course, could be driven by the number of palliative care physicians who are available, who are within that particular tertiary setting and who are on call, etc.
Okay, thanks. I think we just have time for this one last question, which comes from Magnolia, who asks, what is your view of the usefulness of routine monitoring of futile interventions and periodic feedback to hospital managers and clinicians to reduce the incidence of futile treatments? So routine monitoring and periodic feedback to hospital managers and clinicians.
Look, I might start with a stab, and thanks for the question, Magnolia. I know you and Ken are doing a bunch of work in this field as well. Look, I think that would be a very useful and important step forward to try and translate some of the work that we and others, including yourself, have done in trying to understand why futile treatment's happening. So one of the causes, of course, is doctors' own perceptions and understanding how hospital systems work as well. And so the monitoring and feedback loop that you mentioned before could go some way to at least tackling part of those reasons that Lindy mentioned.
I agree. That would be very valuable. Would provide some evidence, and I think that's a great idea.
Thank you. Well, I think we'll draw things to a close about there. Is that right, Sarah?
Yeah.
Just want to thank Ben and Lindy again very much for a really interesting presentation, and encourage people to follow up by reading their papers, which I've really enjoyed as well. So thank you again.